There is a perception in some quarters in the Jewish world and many people in Washington that there is an epidemic of pro Palestinian anti Semitism on college campuses, which makes life not just uncomfortable, but even unsafe for many, many Jewish students. You're a university president, and you're a president actually of a pretty progressive place, right? I imagine a university where there are quite a number of students who have pretty strong views that are critical of Israel and sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. What's your sense of this as someone who actually spends his life on a university campus?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that there's been an increase in permissible anti Semitism in society in the United States, especially both on the left and on the right. There are more people who can say nasty things about Jews without consequences than had been the case for maybe the last 25 years, 35 years. Mark Oppenheimer had a piece in the Wall Street Journal in the last couple of days where he talked a little bit about this. Seemed to me right on. And so college campuses are not immune to that. And the anti Semitism on college campuses is associated with the pro Palestinian protests. And with some reason, I mean, on some campuses, those protests included the harassment of Jews on campus. But at most campuses, I think that was not the case. You know, the vast majority of campuses, the protests against the war in Gaza were nonviolent. There was very little vandalism, you know, and maybe a handful or two handfuls of cases, there were really bad actions by protesters that declared parts of a campus off limits to Jews, or Jews either felt uncomfortable because of what was being said or were uncomfortable because what was being done to them. And of course, that got a lot of attention, as it should have, I think. On the other hand, these campuses have long been like Harvard, Columbia, Northwestern, Chicago. These are some of the places that UCLA where there have been a lot of there was more violence in the protests. These places have long been very hospitable to Jews and to Jewish concerns, and remain so today. You know, whether it's the leadership of the universities or their academic departments or their research functions, there's no evidence that I know of discrimination against Jews in that regard. And so the uptick in anti-Semitic activity and what I called before permissible anti-Semitism is, I think, noteworthy. And I think we, not just Jews, but Jews, we have a special interest in calling this out and combating it when we see it. And at the same time, I don't probably have to tell your crowd this, but we have to be very careful not to conflate pro-Palestinian activism with anti-Semitism. They're not the same thing. On my campus, probably the same percentage of Jews among the pro-Palestinian protesters as there are on campus generally. It's certainly true that the vocal pro-Palestinian movement may have led to the marginalization of pro-Israel people on campus. But the way to combat that is to take a stand and speak up if that's your politics, just like in any other situation. So I think that there's a real issue there, both internationally and in the United States and on college campuses. On the other hand, what I've been talking about more recently is the ways in which the Trump administration in particular and other groups have been using this uptick of anti-Semitism as a pretext to make Israel more immune to criticism or to advance other agendas in the case of the Trump administration. And I think that's not good for the country. It's not good for the Jews. And I think we ought to call that out as well. So unfortunately, it's a complicated picture. Anti-Semitism is real. It's happening on college campuses. That was no surprise to me, actually. I always didn't expect it to go away suddenly. And anti-Semitism is being used to accelerate a path towards authoritarianism.
Before we even get to the Trump administration, what is your sense of how you think university leadership in general responded to the protests that began to follow October 7th before Trump came in? I mean, there were, again, from my perspective, it seems like even before we get into Trump, the right of permissible protest seemed to start to become significantly constrained on a lot of campuses. Even before Trump came in with his agenda, there were campuses where Jewish Force for Peace or Students for Justice in Palestine were suspended or banned. It felt, again, maybe this is my own political bias, it felt to me sometimes like university presidents were under pressure from politicians, from outside organizations, from donors.
The Jewish conspiracy.
Yeah, or I mean, not only Jewish, but just, pro-Israel people, Jewish or not,
Yeah.
who didn't really like having these loud pro-Palestinian students around, and responded by making it more difficult and also by being much more punitive when there were infractions of whatever the rules were. I'm curious what your analysis would be.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there was a national conversation about campuses getting out of control in the spring of 2024 with the encampments. And in many cases, those encampments were, at least I understood them to be, attempts to bear witness to a moral atrocity. And that for many students, this was a generational moment. That is, that they were not a particularly political generation. I mean, since Occupy Wall Street, there hadn't been, maybe some for George Floyd, but COVID interfered with some of that expressive politics. Here was a time for many American students to say that what was going on in Gaza was morally reprehensible. And so many students took that opportunity around the country. And the demand that the protesters had in common, for the most part, was divestment from companies that do business with Israel, and sometimes boycotting scholars or other people from Israel. In most cases, I mean, I can't think of there may have been a case or two where actually the university agreed with those demands. I can't think of one off the top of my head. And so, but there was a lot of a national conversation that this had gotten out of control and students weren't there to do that. And I think a lot of people, especially within the Jewish community, but not only within the Jewish community, were surprised at the level of anger against the nature of a war that Israel was conducting. And so we could talk about why it's the case. I have Israeli friends who say, yeah, what about those other wars? That whataboutism, that it must be that they're really anti-Semites and it's coming out. But I think for a lot of people, let's say I'm 68, and my generation, and even a generation in the middle, so to speak, between me and the students, they were surprised by how easy it was for students to express their contempt for Israel. I was surprised, especially that young Jews were just appalled by Israeli policies, and that being appalled by Israeli policies spilled over into even a deeper critique or deeper rejection of Israel. And so I think one of the things we saw was a recognition of this generational shift in how much of the country was aligned, especially educated Americans, that is, people that were in college or had recently graduated from college. So I think that schools then felt empowered to say, yeah, well, we don't have to put up with this crap. Nobody in my position really likes being protested. And so they became what people now call the Palestinian exception for academic freedom or Palestinian exception for free speech. So I wrote this thing in the New York Times at the end of the summer. Kind of provocatively, they entitled it, I want my students to be more political this year. Because everybody was saying, let's calm things down, let's calm things down. And so I wrote this piece about it. I want them to be engaged. Now, what I said in the piece was, I want them to go work on a campaign. I want them to participate in the public sphere. And at my campus and many other places, actually in the fall when there was a demonstration, I did call the police. Now, that wasn't, in my case, it wasn't because I had changed my policy. It was because the students violated the policy that they didn't violate in the spring. And they, I think they wanted to get arrested, or at least wanted to have their picture taken with policemen for Instagram. And they did. And things did quiet down. I think there was a feeling of there were repercussions for certain kind of protests. So that may have stifled speech or protest. But I think there was also a sense of, what should I call it, fatigue, really, that nothing seemed to be changing in Gaza. And that moment of protest which, on college campuses, I hate to say it, is very seasonal. It's really a springtime activity. That quieted down on campuses in the fall. In our case, we agreed that the protesters demand that Wesleyan consider an argument for divestment. And by Wesleyan, I mean the Board of Trustees. I did have some board members who were unhappy that I allowed it to get to their level, that it would seem to some of my colleagues on the board to have elevated their demand more than is justified. But I explained why I thought this was the least of our issues and that they were free to vote against this, which I expected them to do, and they did. The students did make their arguments. They discovered their arguments were really badly constructed, actually, which is not a bad thing to learn while you're a student. And some were quite unhappy about having that rejection. But from my perspective, it worked out pretty well because I thought they organized, they made a statement, they got a response. It wasn't the response they wanted, but I do believe, since I was in the thick of it, that they were heard, that the trustees heard them, that the faculty heard them. They didn't end the war in Gaza, but they were bearing witness to what was happening there.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.